The nor'easter hit Halifax harbour before the news stations had finished warning people to stay indoors. Audra Trent had been sitting in the gap between two dumpsters behind a shuttered fish processing plant on Lower Water Street for 3 hours before the storm found her. She had known it was coming. She could feel it the way she used to feel IEDs, a specific pressure change in the air that made the back of her neck go cold. But knowing and being able to do anything about it were two entirely different things. She pulled Rook tighter against her chest. The Belgian Malinois was 42 kilograms of what used to be pure, disciplined speed and instinct. Now he was trembling, his short, tawny coat soaked through and inadequate against the wind raking off the North Atlantic. His left foreleg was wrapped in a torn strip of Audra's undershirt, the makeshift bandage dark at the edges where the blistering from the fire hadn't fully healed. Every few minutes, he exhaled a long, rattling breath that wasn't the sound of a healthy dog catching his wind. It was the sound of a dog running out of it. "I know," Audra said into the fur behind his ear. "I know, buddy. I know." She had been saying it for 4 months. She unzipped her naval field jacket, the last item with a Canadian Armed Forces patch still sewn to the sleeve, and wrapped it over the dog's shivering frame, tucking the collar under his chin. The wind hit her immediately, cutting through her thin thermal top like it had something personal against her skin. She didn't move the jacket back. The last 4 months had taken them from Dartmouth to Fredericton to 3 rotations through Moncton, always moving, never staying long enough to be found. They slept under highway upperpasses and in the back stairwells of parkades. They ate when Audra could find day labor. Mostly loading docks, mostly cash, always from men who didn't ask for ID. She spent every dollar on Rook high-protein food, saline solution for the burns, a black market bottle of amoxicillin she could barely afford from a contact she trusted less and less with each passing week. Every shelter she'd approached had one policy: no large dogs. Every no had cost her something she couldn't get back. To the Department of National Defense, Petty Officer Second Class Audra Trent was absent without leave. A disciplinary problem. A woman who had stolen classified operational equipment, that was the phrase they used, classified operational equipment, and disappeared into the civilian population. To Audra, she was just a person who refused to let her best friend be killed because a corrupt superior officer needed to clean up after himself. It had started 9 months ago during a routine building search at CFB Halifax's secondary logistics facility. An anonymous tip had flagged the structure for contraband, and Rook had been assigned to sweep it before the military police unit moved in. He was the best nose on the base, 4 years of active deployment, 2 commendations, a detection record that made him a liability to anyone who didn't want things found. He had found something. Audra didn't know what it was at first. She'd watched him work his way around a back office, methodical and silent, and then suddenly drop into a hard alert over a floor safe that wasn't listed on the building's registered inventory. Before she could call it in, the fire started. She would learn later that the fire had been deliberately set. At the time, all she knew was that the back hallway was full of smoke and her dog was still inside. Rook had come out through a window because Audra had been screaming his name from the courtyard, and Belgian Malinois are not dogs that respond well to hearing their handler in distress. He'd hit the asphalt on 3 legs, his left foreleg badly burned, and still he'd tried to stand and come to her. She'd caught him. She'd kept him from falling, and she'd noticed the small sealed evidence capsule in his mouth. The type handlers trained their dogs to swallow in hostile territory to prevent retrieval by enemy combatants. The fire must have knocked it loose from wherever it had been concealed. Rook had done exactly what his training had conditioned him to do, secured the item. The problem was that he'd secured it in his stomach. Commander Declan Broome had arrived 20 minutes after the fire suppression team. He'd been calm in a way that struck Audra as deeply wrong. Not the calm of a man relieved there were no serious injuries, but the calm of a man watching a known problem resolve itself. He had walked directly to the veterinary transport vehicle where Rook was being assessed and pulled the duty vet aside for a conversation Audra wasn't supposed to hear. She heard it anyway. Rook was classified as behaviorally unpredictable following smoke inhalation. His injury had compromised his operational utility. He was to be euthanized by 0700. Audra had spent the rest of that night in the veterinary holding facility. She'd signed nothing. She'd told no one where she was going. She'd carried Rook out to a pickup truck, belonging to a civilian contractor who owed her a favor, driven to Dartmouth, and started running. Now it was February. Now it was a nor'easter. Now Rook's breathing had that rattle in it that she'd been trying not to count for 3 weeks, and the day labor had dried up because the docks were frozen shut and Halifax was the worst possible place she could be, because it was the city she'd come from. But Rook had stopped being able to walk more than a kilometre without lying down, and she had nowhere else to go. She heard footsteps. "We're moving," Audra said without looking up, her voice flat, practiced, the voice of someone interrupted enough times to anticipate it. "Give us a minute." "You're not being asked to move." The voice was not a police officer's voice. It was something older than authority. The kind of voice that had already been through every room authority thought it owned and had simply decided to stay. Audra looked up slowly. The woman standing at the mouth of the alley was perhaps 90 years old, perhaps older. She was wrapped in a dark green wool coat with a broad fur collar, her white hair pressed flat under a black hat that had seen better decades, but still carried itself with a certain dignity. She leaned on a cane, silver-handled, a compass rose worked into the grip, but she wasn't leaning heavily. She used it the way certain people use stillness, as a choice rather than a necessity. Her eyes were grey. Audra registered that first, grey and absolutely direct. "That is a D&D tactical vest," the old woman said. Her accent was Nova Scotian, the flat, blunt consonants of someone who had never once considered softening them for a stranger. "The dog is wearing a Canadian Armed Forces K9 identification tag filed down on one side, likely to obscure a serial number, and you are shielding his left side with your body, which tells me the injury is on that flank." A slight tilt of her head. "You are a handler, and given that you are sitting in a blizzard behind a bait shop, instead of claiming your VAC benefits, I suspect he didn't come with you voluntarily on the paperwork." Audra's hand went to the tactical knife on her belt. Every instinct built over 4 months of paranoia told her to pick up the dog and run. "Who are you?" she demanded. Rook lifted his head at the tension in her voice and tried to stand. His left foreleg buckled immediately. He let out a low, involuntary sound. Not quite a whine, something more private than that, and Audra put her hand flat on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, which was too fast and too shallow, and had been both of those things for a month. "My name is Mabel Corrigan," the old woman said. She didn't step back. She didn't change her posture. "My husband was Rear Admiral Owen Corrigan. He spent 31 years with Maritime Forces Atlantic and wrote the original integration protocols for the K9 units at CFB Halifax in 1989. He knew more about military working dogs than anyone currently sitting at D&D. She looked at Rook steadily. "That dog is dying, and you are 20 minutes from hypothermia. My house is 4 blocks from here. You will come with me." "I'm not going anywhere with someone I don't know." "I know your name," Mabel said. "I know your service number. I know the name of the officer who signed the euthanasia order for your dog, and I know why he signed it. That is not information I intend to discuss in an alleyway in a nor'easter." She turned, not looking back. "Come or don't. But if you don't, that dog will not survive the night. And the man hunting you won't need to do much work come morning." Audra looked down at Rook. His amber eyes met hers with the uncomplicated faithfulness that had, for years, been the most reliable thing in her world. She picked him up. He was 42 kilograms, and she was running on 3 days of minimal food and no real sleep. But she picked him up, and she followed the old woman into the white wall of the storm. The house on Hollis Street sat behind a stone wall and a wrought iron gate, 3 stories of dark granite and tall windows, the kind of house built when the harbour was still the economic heart of the city. Mabel unlocked the front door without ceremony and held it open. The warmth that hit Audra in the face when she crossed the threshold was almost painful. The house smelled of old books and cedar, and something that might have been the ghost of pipe tobacco, absorbed over decades into the plaster walls. "The parlour," Mabel said. "The rug near the fireplace, not directly on it. His temperature needs to come up gradually." Audra set Rook down on a thick hand-woven rug in dark reds and blues, and he immediately stretched flat, his whole body surrendering to the warmth with a long exhale that sounded for just a moment less labored than it had in weeks. "Stay here," Mabel said, and walked out. Alone, Audra looked around the room. It was the kind of room that accumulates rather than being decorated, a lifetime of specific objects arranged significance rather than aesthetics, military shadow boxes on the walls, a folded flag in a triangular case above the fireplace, photographs everywhere, the oldest in black and white, the more recent in color but still formal, taken at official occasions and careful about it. She pulled herself to her knees to look at the nearest, a man in Royal Canadian Navy dress whites, gold stripe at commander's rank on his sleeves. A young version of a face she could see echoed, now 90 years worn, in the woman who'd walked her out of the alley. There were other photographs. A younger man, mid-30s, in a civilian suit, but with the posture of someone who had never entirely stopped being military. Audra looked at him without quite knowing why her attention snagged on his face. Mabel returned carrying a tray, on it a mug of tea, a bowl of chicken and rice, a smaller dish of the same for Rook, no commentary, no watching Audra's face for gratitude. "Small portions for the dog," Mabel said, setting the tray on the low table. "He hasn't been eating properly. His stomach will reject too much at once." Audra took the smaller bowl and sat back down on the floor beside Rook. She fed him from her palm, one mouthful at a time, watching the spark come back into his eyes as the smell of real food reached him. He ate with absolute precision, the way he'd always eaten. Careful, deliberate, trusting her completely. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear hit the back of her hand, and Rook paused and licked it. "You know my name," Audra said finally. "You haven't asked me a single thing. Why?" Mabel sat in a high-backed chair opposite, both hands resting on her cane. "Because I already know the material facts," she said. "I wanted to see whether you'd run the moment the door was warm. You didn't." She looked at Audra steadily. "That tells me something important. You said you know who signed the euthanasia order." "Commander Declan Broome." The name came out of her mouth with a particular flatness, the way you say a name you've repeated in anger so many times that it stopped making you angry and started making you tired. "He has been in Maritime Forces Atlantic logistics and intelligence coordination for 11 years. He is decorated, he is well connected. He is, by all formal accounts, an exemplary officer." She paused. "He is also the man who has been routing decommissioned naval hardware to a private broker in Rotterdam. Since 2019, guidance components, navigation arrays, not weapons themselves, components from which weapons can be assembled. The kind of thing that makes certain buyers willing to pay considerable sums of cash into accounts that do not exist on any government record." Audra set down the empty bowl and looked up. "How do you know this?" Mabel reached beside her chair and lifted a manila envelope from the side table. She set it on the coffee table without opening it. "Because my son spent 2 years building the case." Audra looked at the envelope, then at the photographs on the wall, the younger man in the civilian suit. She said quietly. "He died 14 months ago," Mabel said. A training accident, the report read. He wasn't active military, he was a D&D contract investigator, and he had no business being on the water during an ice clearance exercise. And everyone who reviewed the incident report knew that, and no one said so officially. Her grip on the cane tightened by one careful fraction. His name was Patrick Corrigan. He was 38 years old. He had a daughter who is 6 now, and has his eyes. The room was very quiet. Outside, the nor'easter pressed itself against the windows. The fire at CFB Halifax, Audra said slowly. Broome knew an independent audit had been requested on the secondary logistics facility. He ordered the fire to destroy the physical records before the audit team arrived. Mabel's voice was completely controlled, which somehow made it worse. What he didn't anticipate was that my son had already photographed the most critical documents and sealed copies in a fireproof evidence capsule in that office, to be retrieved by the audit team the following morning. Audra felt the specific cold she had felt the night of the fire. Not the cold of weather, but the cold of a truth arriving that changes the shape of everything you thought you understood. She looked at Rook. He was watching her, steady, patient, trusting. He didn't drop it, she said slowly. In the fire. It came loose from wherever Patrick hid it and Rook picked it up, and he's trained to swallow small retrieved items in hostile situations to prevent capture. Yes, Mabel said. He's been carrying it for 4 months. Yes. If Broome reviewed the exercise footage, if he had anyone watching the dog handling footage from that night. He knows the dog retrieved the capsule, Mabel said. He reviewed it within 48 hours of the fire. The euthanasia order was signed that same afternoon. Audra stared at the floor. The full architecture of the last 4 months reassembled itself in her mind with entirely new geometry. She hadn't just gone AWOL with a dog. She had walked off a naval base carrying the only remaining copy of evidence that could send a decorated officer to federal prison, evidence that also proved why a contract investigator had been quietly murdered 14 months ago on a frozen harbor. He hasn't been hunting me because I took Rook, Audra said. No. He's been hunting Rook. You are incidental to what he wants, Mabel confirmed, though by now you are not incidental to what he needs to silence. She met Audra's eyes without flinching. The capsule is titanium sealed. It cannot be digested, and it was not designed for long-term internal storage. I had a contact pull Rook's imaging from a veterinary database from his last official check-in before you left the base. There is a blockage in his upper intestinal tract. The capsule is causing a slow, toxic reaction. What you've been attributing to the burns and to poor nutrition, the labored breathing, the reduced appetite, the progressive weakness, it's the capsule, Audra said. The words came out like something she had to force through a closing door. He needs surgery tonight, Mabel said, or his liver will begin to fail. Audra pressed her hand flat against Rook's side. His heartbeat moved against her palm, too fast, too shallow, a rhythm that had been quietly wrong for weeks while she'd told herself it was the cold, it was the stress, it was everything except what it was. I need a vet, Audra said, a real one, but the moment anyone runs his chip has been flagged in the system since the night you left, I'm aware. Mabel reached toward a velvet cord near the fireplace and pulled it once. My husband wrote the integration protocols for the K9 units at this base. What I didn't mention is that the veterinarian he worked most closely with on that project was a young graduate student from Dalhousie who went on to spend 22 years as the senior surgical veterinarian at CFB Gagetown. A door at the back of the hallway opened. He retired 3 years ago. He has been in my guest room since this morning, because I have been looking for you for 6 weeks, Audra, and I needed to be ready when I found you. And the man who walked in was perhaps 65, with the careful, economical movements of someone who had spent decades in surgical environments. He wore a sterile scrub top over civilian trousers and carried a stainless steel case with the calm of someone who had made peace a long time ago with being called upon at difficult hours. Dr. Callum Ferris, Mabel said. He does not need an introduction to dogs like Rook. He trained the first 2 K9 units that came through CFB Halifax under Owen's protocol. Dr. Ferris crouched beside the Malinois. He ran his hands along the dog's flank with practiced gentleness, checked the burn on the foreleg, pressed 2 fingers lightly against the abdomen, and studied what he found with an expression that confirmed everything Mabel had just said. The anesthesia is a significant risk given his current condition, Dr. Ferris said, looking at Audra directly. But the alternative is no option at all. I have a sterile space set up in the lower level. We need to move now. Audra looked at Rook. He had turned his head toward the veterinarian's hands, not with anxiety, but with the cautious, fair-minded assessment he gave to people. Audra hadn't signaled as threats. She put her hand along his jaw. He pressed into it. "You do what needs doing," she told him quietly. "I'll be right here." Dr. Ferris and Mabel helped Audra carry Rook downstairs into a space that bore no resemblance to a basement. Stainless steel table, adjustable surgical lamps, a portable cardiac monitor already running, IV equipment laid out on a sterile field. Someone had prepared this space with the kind of thoroughness that only comes from knowing exactly what they were preparing for. "You need to wait upstairs," Dr. Ferris said, already placing the IV line with the efficiency of long reflex. Audra's hand rested on Rook's paw. The Malinois was already going heavy with the sedative, his breathing slowing to something softer, the constant tension in his muscles finally beginning to release. She leaned down and put her forehead against his. "I've got you," she said. "I had you the whole time. You did good, Rook. You did so good." Then she straightened and walked back up the stairs. Mabel was standing at the tall parlor window when Audra returned, looking out at the driven white of the storm. The fire had burned lower. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked with the steady indifference of something that has outlasted many urgent moments and will outlast many more. "There's something else," Mabel began. "Tonight. Something." The lights went out. Not a flicker, not the gradual brownout of an overtaxed grid. One moment they were on, the next full dark, total and immediate, broken only by the dying amber of the fireplace coals. 4 seconds later, a low vibration moved through the floor as the backup generator engaged, and a pale line of light appeared under the basement door. Dr. Ferris still had power. Rook still had power. But the rest of the house was dark. "He found the main disconnect," Mabel said from the window. She had not moved. Her voice had not changed. East side of the property, behind the garden gate. The intercom near the parlor door crackled. Dr. Ferris's voice focused and even. "I have power down here. I need uninterrupted time. Do not let anyone through that door." Audra was already moving. She had the tactical knife off her belt and the heavy steel torch from her pack in her right hand. 4 months of running had stripped nearly everything from her, but they had not touched the part of her that had trained for precisely this kind of dark, a building, an intruder with fresh legs and better equipment, and a mission that could not be interrupted. She pressed her back to the hallway wall and slowed her breathing to almost nothing. "The conservatory," Mabel said from the dark parlor, barely above a whisper. "East wing. That's where he'll come through." Audra moved through the hallway by memory. She had catalogued the house without intending to, the way handlers catalogue every space they move through, because spaces become tactical environments the moment anything goes wrong. She pressed herself into the doorframe of the dining room and listened past the howl of the storm. Glass, the precise, limited sound of a single pane being scored and lifted out, not broken. He wasn't forcing entry, he was trained. She waited. Wet snow on antique rug. 1 step, 2, deliberate and nearly silent, the footfall distribution of someone moving in a tactical crouch with night optics on. She could see the faint green cast of the monocle as he turned the corner into the hallway. She didn't rush. She let him come to where she needed him to be. When he was 2 meters from her position, she swung the steel torch in a sharp horizontal arc at the night vision rig mounted at his temple. The optic shattered with a sound like breaking crockery. The intruder lurched sideways, pulling the trigger on the suppressed rifle by instinct. 2 rounds hit the plaster ceiling. A third punched through the wainscoting to her left. She drove her shoulder into his chest before he could reorient, taking them both into the hallway wall. He was bigger and fresher and better fed. He got a forearm across her throat and used his weight to pin her against the plaster, his free hand reaching for the sidearm at his hip. "Broome sends his regards," he said, flat, deliberate, the English of someone who'd learned it as a professional requirement. The shot was enormous in the confined space of the hallway. The intruder went still. His grip on Audra's throat released. He slid down the wall in careful stages, as though choosing very deliberately where to rest. Mabel stood at the mouth of the hallway. She was holding a Browning high-power, polished, clearly maintained, the kind of sidearm that had been carried by officers of the Royal Canadian Navy for 30 years before it was retired from service. Both hands on the grip, elbows locked, feet at shoulder width. The muzzle was still producing a faint thread of smoke. "Tell him yourself," Mabel said to the man who could no longer hear her. She lowered the weapon with the composure of someone returning a pen to its holder. The intercom buzzed. "It's done." Dr. Ferris's voice came through rough with exhaustion and something else, the particular quality of relief that only exists on the other side of a very long stretch of focused fear. "We have it. He came through clean. He is going to be fine." Audra sat down on the hallway floor. She sat on the antique runner with her back against the plaster and her knees pulled to her chest, and she did not move for a long time. The storm continued to press itself against the windows. The clock ticked. Mabel came and sat in the chair nearest the hallway door, set the Browning on the side table with the careful deliberateness of someone not pretending that didn't happen and did not speak. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. 72 hours later, an encrypted file containing the decrypted contents of the titanium evidence capsule was transmitted simultaneously to the DND Inspector General's office, the office of the Judge Advocate General, and a specific investigative journalist at CBC News, whose name Mabel produced from memory without consulting anything. Commander Declan Broome was arrested at Maritime Forces Atlantic headquarters on a Thursday morning. 4 officers formed the detail because the arrest authority had been quietly advised that Broome was the kind of man who would attempt something if he sensed a moment of ambiguity. He was charged with fraud against the Crown, breach of trust, criminal negligence in the death of Patrick Corrigan, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The list of charges took nearly 3 minutes to read aloud at his initial appearance. He stood through all of it without expression, which was, in its own way, a kind of answer. The pardon application moved through channels that normal applications do not typically reach, pressured along by people who had known Rear Admiral Owen Corrigan for 30 years and who received a specific phone call from his widow on the Sunday after the arrest. Audra's honorable discharge was reinstated. Her back pay was calculated and transferred. Her Veterans Affairs file was unfrozen. None of that was what she was looking at. She was looking at a document on the coffee table in Mabel's parlor, the replacement coffee table, because the original had been broken before she arrived, as Mabel had mentioned once and then never mentioned again. The document bore DND letterhead and the signature of the Director of Canadian Forces Veterinary Services. Legal transfer of K9 Unit MA-19, operational designation Rook, to former Petty Officer 2nd Class Audra Trent approved with full pension credit for the animal's service years. Rook was asleep on the Persian rug near the fire. He wore a soft support bandage on his left foreleg and a clear surgical dressing across his abdomen, and he was the deepest asleep Audra had ever seen him, the sleep of a body that has finally set down something heavy it had been carrying for a very long time, without quite knowing it was carrying anything at all. He looked, she thought, like himself again. Mabel walked in from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea, which she set down without asking whether Audra wanted one, because Mabel Corrigan did not generally ask questions when she had already determined the answer. "You'll have noticed," Mabel said, settling into her chair, "that the guest room on the 2nd floor has a south-facing window. Dogs do well with morning sun." Audra glanced up from the document. "We've been enough of an imposition." "You haven't been an imposition," Mabel said. "You've been a solution." She looked at Rook, then back at Audra with the direct, unhurried gaze of a woman who had been deciding things clearly for 9 decades and saw no reason to change the habit now. "This house has 11 rooms and 1 occupant. Dr. Ferris comes on Wednesdays to tend the garden, which is more work than one retired veterinarian can manage on his own, and Patrick's daughter visits every 2nd weekend. She has been convinced, since she was very small, that every home is improved by the presence of a dog." Mabel lifted her mug. "My husband always said the best postings were the ones you didn't plan for." Audra looked at the document in her hands, at the winter light beginning to move through the lace curtains of the tall south window, at Rook sleeping by the fire with all 4 legs loose and his breathing steady and even, and finally even. She had spent 4 months running from everything she'd known. She had not once, in all that running, stopped to consider what she might eventually stop for. "Yes, ma'am," Audra said quietly. "I think he might be right."